The Atlantic did not bargain with the men of Ocracoke. It simply took. Inside the damp cedar-planked sanctuary of the Methodist Church, the air tasted of salt old hymnals and cold panic. Silas Sterling stood at the altar, his boots pressing hard into the floorboards, his knuckles white against the dark wood of the railing. Outside, the gray surf hammered the cliffs, a rhythmic, booming reminder of the debt he owed. If he didn't sign the marriage ledger within the hour, Arthur Pendleton would revoke the state salvage contract, the bank would foreclose on the Sterling shipyard, and 14 families who depended on his timber and iron would face the brutal winter with empty pockets. Silas was trapped not by a woman, but by the sea and the law. The 63 people packed into the narrow pews did not come to celebrate a union. They came to witness a hanging. The whispers rose like the hum of a hornet's nest vibrating through the cold air. They knew the stakes. They knew that Silas, a proud man whose father had built the finest hulls on the Outer Banks, was being forced into a corner by the port authorities. And they knew exactly who was walking through that door to claim him. At 32, Cora Vance was the town's permanent shadow, a woman the island had long since rendered invisible. When her boots finally clicked against the threshold, a sudden suffocating silence fell over the room. Mothers pulled their daughters closer. Old men stared at their hands. They called her a jinx, a living omen of the Atlantic's cruelty. 11 years ago, her fiancé, the brave rescue captain Julian Cross, had taken his crew out into a Category 4 hurricane to save a stranded cargo vessel. He had never returned, and the town, in its grief and superstition, had laid the blame for the tragedy squarely on the young woman he left behind. For over a decade, Cora had endured their averted eyes and cruel isolation, walking the sandy roads alone, a ghost among the living. But as Cora moved down the aisle, her spine was as straight as a mainmast. She did not wear white. She wore a simple, dark navy blue dress she had stitched herself from heavy cotton, the fabric immaculate and unyielding against the draft. Her hands were folded neatly in front of her, showing no tremor, no sign of the humiliation the town expected her to display. She looked neither left nor right, ignoring the venomous stares of Beatrice Thorne and the smug, watchful grin of Thaddeus Vance, who sat in the front row like a vulture waiting for a carcass. When she reached the altar, she stopped and turned to face the man who had been cornered into taking her hand. Silas looked down at her, his eyes dark, guarded, and filled with the heavy resentment of a man who had lost his freedom. He expected tears. He expected a broken woman grateful for a legal name and financial survival. Instead, Cora looked directly into his eyes, lifted her chin, and did the one thing no one in Ocracoke anticipated. She smiled. It was not a smile of submission, nor was it the hysterical grin of a desperate woman. It was a quiet, luminous expression of absolute dignity, a silent declaration that the judgment of the 63 people behind her could not touch her. To Silas, it felt like an unexpected lantern struck in the dead of a coastal storm. It confused him, irritated him, and deeply intrigued him. The Reverend cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly as he opened the heavy leather-bound book. The words of the ceremony were spoken quickly, stripped of any warmth or celebratory cadence, sounding more like a court ruling than a holy matrimony. When Silas pronounced his vows, his voice was a low, gravelly baritone that echoed off the bare rafters, firm but entirely devoid of affection. Cora replied with a calm, melodic steadiness that surprised the congregation. She spoke her promises not to the walls of the church, but directly to Silas, as if acknowledging the heavy burden they were now forced to carry together. With the scratching of a goosequill pen on the official state ledger, the deed was done. Arthur Pendleton stepped forward from the shadows of the vestry, his eyes scanning the signatures with bureaucratic coldness. He gave Silas a curt, unsatisfied nod. The contract was secure for another winter. The shipyard would survive, but the price had been paid in flesh and pride. As they turned to leave the altar, Silas offered Cora his arm. It was a stiff, reluctant gesture, an obligation of the public eye. When her gloved hand rested on his heavy wool sleeve, Silas felt an unexpected warmth through the fabric. They walked back down the aisle together, a strange, silent tableau of survival. The congregation remained frozen, the whispers dying in their throats, defeated by the sheer, unbothered grace of the woman they had spent 11 years trying to break. Outside, the heavy oak doors opened to a wall of gray wind. The storm was worsening the sky, bruising into a deep, violent purple over the Pamlico Sound. Silas led Cora toward his open wooden wagon, the horse shaking its mane against the biting sea spray. As he helped her up onto the hard bench, he noticed the way she looked out toward the churning horizon, her expression shifting from defiance to something deep, sorrowful, and ancient. Silas climbed up beside her, snapping the reins to set the wagon into motion. They left the village behind, moving down the narrow sandy spit of land toward the isolated peninsula where his father's house stood alone against the salt marshes. Neither of them spoke. The wind howled between them, carrying the weight of 1,000 unasked questions. Silas kept his gaze fixed on the road, his mind racing with the financial ruin he had just avoided and the domestic mystery he had just brought into his life. He did not know this woman. He did not know why she smiled or what secrets she carried from the ghost of Julian Cross. All he knew was that the storm outside was nothing compared to the quiet upheaval that had just entered his home, an upheaval that would begin the moment they crossed the threshold of the lonely house in the marsh. The silence inside the wooden wagon was not the heavy, suffocating kind that bred resentment. It was the dense, watchful quiet of two survivalists measuring each other's strides. Silas kept his eyes fixed on the muddy track ahead, his large, calloused hands guiding the horses with practiced ease. The storm was catching up to them, tossing gray caps across the expanse of the salt marshes and forcing the scent of low tide and wet pine through the gaps in their coats. Beside him, Cora sat perfectly still, her posture unyielding against the violent jolts of the wooden bench. She didn't clutch at her skirts or sigh with the dramatic fatigue the women in town often favored. She simply watched the landscape change her face, a calm, unreadable slate. When the wagon finally crested the gravel ridge, the Sterling estate came into view, sitting like an old gray gull on the edge of the marsh peninsula. It was a massive two-story structure built of weathered cypress, flanked by a sprawling shipyard where 3 half-finished hulls loomed like skeletal giants against the purple sky. The house had been built by Silas's father to withstand the worst of the Atlantic gales. But without a woman's touch, for the past 5 years, it had taken on a stark, austere appearance. The windows were bare, the porch boards were scrubbed clean but grayed by salt air, and the only sign of life was the thin wisp of smoke curling from the massive stone chimney. Silas pulled the horses to a halt near the side porch. He climbed down his boots, sinking into the wet sand, and reached up to offer Cora his hand. For a second, her smaller cotton-gloved fingers rested in his palm. Her grip was surprisingly firm, devoid of the delicate hesitation he had anticipated. "The wind will turn by nightfall," Silas said, his voice a low rumble breaking the hours of silence. It was the first time he had spoken to her as his wife, and the word felt heavy, almost foreign, in his throat. "We'll want to get the trunks inside before the rain starts in earnest." Cora nodded, stepping down onto the porch boards. "The house has good bones, Silas. Your father chose his timber well." He paused, a trunk balanced against his broad shoulder, looking at her with a furrowed brow. Most people in Ocracoke spoke of his family's land as an isolated prison, a wasteland of mud and mosquitoes. To hear her judge it by the quality of its wood was unexpected. He led her through the heavy oak door and into the kitchen, the true heart of the house. A massive hearth dominated the far wall, and a long, scarred pine table sat in the center surrounded by mismatched chairs. The air inside smelled of wood smoke, linseed oil, and dried bay leaves, the scent of men who lived by their hands. Cora pulled off her gloves, placing them neatly beside her small reticule on the table. She looked around the room, her eyes lingering on the neat stacks of ledgers and iron bolts piled in the corner. "I don't expect a fairy tale, Silas," she said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the crackle of the hearth fire. "And I know you didn't choose me out of affection. You needed the state contract to keep these docks open, and I needed a roof where my presence wasn't treated as an insult to the dead. We have a legal partnership now. I will keep your house, I will cook for your men, and I will handle the accounts if you'll let me. In return, I only ask for peace." Silas set the trunk down with a dull thud. He studied her face, looking for any trace of bitterness or hidden sarcasm, but found only absolute honesty. "You talk more like a merchant than a schoolteacher," he murmured, his defensive guard slipping just a fraction. "A schoolteacher on this island learns to count pennies and character faster than anyone else," Cora replied, the faint ghost of that churchyard smile touching the corners of her lips. "If we are to survive the winter, we might as well understand the ledger we're working with." Before Silas could answer, the heavy back door creaked open, admitting a blast of wet wind and Caleb Finch. The old shipwright was drenched, his wool cap plastered to his bald head, his gray beard tangled with sea spray. He stopped short when he saw Cora, his weathered face softening into an expression of profound relief. He took off his cap, holding it against his chest with rough, trembling hands. "Miss Cora, Mrs. Sterling, I should say," Caleb stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "Forgive the mess, ma'am. We've been trying to secure the white oak timbers at the north slip before the tide rises too high." "There is nothing to forgive, Caleb," Cora said gently, stepping forward to take his wet coat. "Go warm yourself by the fire. Silas tells me the wind is turning." As the old man moved gratefully toward the hearth, he caught Silas's eye and gave a subtle, urgent jerk of his head toward the pantry. Silas followed him out of Cora's earshot, his curiosity piqued by the old man's anxious demeanor. "What is it, Caleb?" "Did the dock line snap?" Silas asked in a low whisper. "No, Silas, it ain't the ships," Caleb said, his eyes darting back toward the kitchen where Cora was already quietly inspecting the pantry shelves. "It's the books. After you left for the church this morning, I found a stack of old iron receipts tucked under the desk in the molding loft. Miss Cora must have found them last week when she came by to collect the school charity wood." "Silas, she didn't just look at them, she marked them." Silas frowned. "Marked them how?" "She cross-referenced the weight of the timber and the iron nails we bought from the Port Authority over the last 3 years. Caleb whispered, his voice shaking with a mix of awe and anger. "Thaddeus Vance and his agents have been shorting us by 2 tons of blacksmith iron every spring. They've been padding the bills, Silas, printing false manifests because they knew your mind was too busy with your father's sickness to check the arithmetic." Miss Cora wrote it all out on the back of a ledger page, every stolen penny clear as day. "If she hadn't found that fraud, the bank would have called our note by next month, contract or no contract." Silas stood frozen in the dim hallway, the revelation striking him like a rogue wave. He looked back through the doorway at Cora. She had found a clean rag and was quietly wiping the dust from his father's old copper kettle, her movements methodical, peaceful, and entirely unbothered by the storm rattling the window panes. The town had spent 11 years calling her a curse, a useless old maid whose very name brought ruin to seafaring men. Yet before she had even taken his name, she had quietly reached into the gears of his failing business and pulled out the rot that Thaddeus Vance had hidden there. She hadn't done it for praise. She hadn't even mentioned it to him during their long, silent ride home. She had simply done the math, laid out the truth, and stepped into his house to begin the work of saving it. Outside, the first heavy drops of the autumn deluge began to lash against the cypress siding, a cold, violent warning of the winter to come. Silas felt a strange, unfamiliar tightness in his chest as he watched his new wife work. He realized then that the battle for his shipyard wasn't over. It had merely shifted ground. Thaddeus Vance would not take the exposure of his fraud lightly, and the town's malice would only grow sharper now that Cora was no longer hiding in her schoolhouse. But as Silas walked back into the warmth of the kitchen, looking at the steady, unbroken posture of the woman at the hearth, he knew one thing for certain. The wolves of Ocracoke had vastly underestimated the schoolteacher, and so had he. The wind outside the cypress walls did not merely blow. It interrogated every seam of the old house, seeking entrance with the persistent icy fingers of an Atlantic autumn. By 8 o'clock, the rain had settled into a steady, rhythmic drumming against the window panes, blurring the distant revolving beacon of the Cape Hatteras lighthouse into a faint, watery smudge on the horizon. Inside the kitchen, the hearth fire threw long amber shadows across the pine floorboards. Cora sat at the long table, the shipyard's massive leather-bound ledger open before her under the soft glow of a kerosene lamp. Her fingers, stained lightly with ink, moved with steady precision down the columns of figures, her pencil scratching softly in the quiet room. Silas stood by the dark window, a mug of black coffee cooling in his hand. He wasn't watching the storm. He was watching her reflection in the glass. He had spent the last 2 hours expecting her to break, waiting for the reality of their hollow marriage or the weight of the town's malice to finally press a tear from her eyes. Earlier that afternoon, a young boy had arrived on horseback to deliver a curt note from Beatrice Thorne, formally dismissing Cora from her duties at the village schoolhouse. The town's matriarch had claimed the decision was made to protect the children from moral confusion, but Silas knew it was a direct retaliatory strike from Thaddeus Vance, a warning shot meant to punish Cora for uncovering the iron fraud. Yet when Cora had read the letter, her face hadn't crumpled. She had simply folded the paper neatly, placed it in her apron pocket, and gone back to checking the shipyard's inventory. "You should be angry," Silas said, his voice cutting through the silence of the kitchen like a heavy timber settling. He turned away from the window, his large frame casting a shadow that reached the edge of her table. They took your school, Cora. They took the only thing you had left in that village, and you sit there counting nails as if it doesn't matter. Cora did not look up immediately. She finished writing a number, blotted the ink with a piece of scrap paper, and then raised her eyes to meet his. The lamplight caught the silver threads in her dark hair, softening the sharp, elegant lines of her jawline. "Anger is an expensive emotion, Silas," she said softly. "It burns through timber that could be used to build a fire. Beatrice Thorne didn't take my school because she cares about the children. She took it because she's afraid. She knows that as long as I'm teaching those Fisher kids to read, she can't cheat their fathers at the docks. If I waste my breath crying over her cruelty, she wins." Silas walked over to the table, setting his mug down with a dull click. He looked down at the ledger, noting the flawless, elegant cursive she used to correct Thaddeus Vance's falsified balances. "The people in that town, they talk about you like you're a ghost that brings the fog," he murmured, his defensive guard dropping further than it ever had before. "They say your name like it's a curse. Why do you let them do it? Why did you look at me in that church and smile when you knew damn well every person in those pews wanted to see you drown?" Cora looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the smooth, worn edge of the wooden table. For a long moment, the only sound was the howling of the gale against the roof. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its pragmatic edge, replaced by a deep, resonant sorrow that seemed to echo from a long-buried chamber of her heart. 11 years ago, Silas, I wasn't an old maid," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the flickering flame of the lamp. "I was 21 and I was promised to Julian Cross. You remember him, don't you?" Silas felt a sudden stiffness in his chest. Everyone on the Outer Banks knew the name of Julian Cross. He had been the captain of the federal life-saving crew, a man whose bravery was legendary along the coast. "I remember," Silas said quietly, sitting down in the heavy chair opposite her. "I was just a boy when his boat went down in the Great Gale. They never found the hull." "No, they didn't," Cora said, a faint, bittersweet tremor touching her lips. "The night before he sailed into that storm to rescue the crew of the Georgia Rose, he stood right out there on the beach. The wind was just like it is tonight, cold, man, and screaming. I was crying, begging him to let the state handle it, begging him not to leave me. He took my face in his hands, Silas. His palms were rough from the oars, but he was so gentle. He looked into my eyes and said, 'Cora, this ocean is a cold, dark place, and it takes whatever it wants. If the dark wins tonight and I don't come back, you have to promise me you'll keep your smile. It's the only lighthouse my soul has left to find its way home.'" She paused, taking a slow, deep breath to steady herself, though her eyes remained clear and dry. "He didn't come back, and the next morning the town didn't want to look at the widows or the empty slips. They needed someone to carry the weight of the tragedy, so they blamed me. They said Julian died because he was distracted by a woman's tears. They called me a jinx, an omen of the deep. For 11 years they tried to make me hide my face, but I promised him, Silas. I promised him that no matter how dark the world got, I would keep the lantern lit. My smile isn't for Beatrice Thorne, and it isn't for Thaddeus Vance. It is my loyalty to Julian. It is the only thing the Atlantic couldn't take from me." Silas sat in the silence that followed the revelation, washing over him with the force of a breaking wave. He had spent years believing the town's gossip, thinking Cora Vance was merely a pathetic, unwanted woman who had withered away in an old schoolhouse. Now, looking at her across the ink-stained ledger, he realized she was the strongest person on Ocracoke Island. Her smile wasn't a mask of weakness or submission. It was an act of magnificent, defiant rebellion against a town too small to understand her grace. He looked at his own massive, calloused hands. Hands that knew how to shape iron and fight the sea, but felt entirely clumsy in the presence of her quiet dignity. A profound sense of shame crept over him for the coldness he had shown her at the altar, for the resentment he had harbored since the contract forced them together. "Cora!" Silas said, his voice dropping into a low, solemn register that vibrated through the quiet kitchen. He reached out his large hand, stopping just short of touching hers on the table, giving her the space she had earned. "I didn't know. I'm sorry for the way I brought you to this house." Cora looked up, and for the first time since they had met, the smile she gave him was different. It didn't have the sharp protective edge of the churchyard or the pragmatism of the ledger. It was a soft, genuine glint of human warmth, a quiet recognition that he had finally looked past the armor to see the person underneath. "You don't have to be sorry, Silas," she said gently, closing the heavy book with a soft sigh. "You gave me a place where I can stand against the wind. That is more than anyone else on this island has given me in 11 years. Now we should rest. The storm will leave a mess at the docks tomorrow, and Caleb said the north slip needs reinforcement before the morning tide." She rose from the table, picking up the lamp and leaving Silas alone in the gathering shadows of the hearth. As he listened to her quiet footsteps fading up the wooden stairs, Silas turned back to the window. The storm outside was still raging, the waves crashing against the marsh grass with relentless fury. But the heavy, suffocating weight that had pressed against his chest since his father's death felt lighter now. He knew Thaddeus Vance would come for them, and he knew the town would not easily forgive their survival. But as he stared into the dark, Silas felt a strange new resolve hardening within his bones. He had married a stranger to save his father's legacy, but as the wind rattled the glass, he knew he would fight the entire Atlantic to keep that lantern burning. The gray light of November brought a different kind of hardship to the Sterling shipyard, measured not in sudden gales, but in the slow, bone-chilling dampness that seeped into the men's joints. By the second week of their marriage, the rhythm of the house on the Marsh Peninsula had shifted. Every morning at dawn, Silas would find a pot of chicory coffee boiling on the hearth and a stack of dense sourdough biscuits wrapped in clean linen on the table. Cora was always up before him, her quiet presence marked only by the neatness she left in her wake. She had taken over the domestic machinery of the estate without a single complaint, moving through the large, drafty rooms like a calm current, resetting the drifted sands of an old beach. While the town of Ocracoke remained cold and distant, treating the Sterling name with a fragile, watchful hostility, the shipyard itself was beginning to soften. It started with Caleb Finch's knees. The old shipwright had been hobbling across the frosty molding lofts for years, his joints ruined by decades of kneeling on damp oak timbers. On a Tuesday afternoon, after watching Caleb struggle to climb down from a half-finished hull, Cora walked into the workshop holding a small amber jar. She had spent the morning boiling wild wax myrtle berries in camphor oil, a remedy she had learned from an old midwife on the mainland. She handed it to the old man without a word of pity, merely stating that the yard couldn't afford a slow carpenter. Within 3 days, Caleb was walking with a straight back, and the casual, crude jests the younger shipwrights usually flung toward Silas's new wife died in their throats. But Cora's true battle wasn't with the grown men, it was with the forgotten shoreline. One crisp afternoon, Silas walked down toward the salt marshes to check on a stack of seasoned cedar boards, and stopped when he heard a voice, soft and rhythmic, rising above the call of the gulls. Behind a row of tall marsh grass, Cora was sitting on an overturned fish crate. Beside her stood Leo, the 9-year-old orphan boy who lived in the hollow of an abandoned bait shack down by the public docks. The village called the boy the Silent Curse, believing his inability to speak was a sign of divine disfavor, a superstition that mirrored the way they had isolated Cora for 11 years. Cora held a large, smoothed whelk shell in her lap. She took Leo's small, dirt-stained hand, pressing his fingers against the spiral grooves of the shell, then brought his hand to her own throat while she hummed a low, vibrating note. The boy's eyes, usually wide with the wild fear of a stray animal, were fixed entirely on her face. Then, using a piece of driftwood, Cora drew a sharp, clear letter S in the wet sand. She pointed to the sea, then back to the letter, mimicking the sound of the wind through the beach grass. Leo watched his chest heaving with a sudden desperate urge to understand, and then he mimicked the shape of the letter with his thin fingers. Cora did not lavish him with false praise. She simply reached out, straightened his posture, and drew the next letter. Silas leaned against the frame of an old whaleboat, his chest tightening with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He had seen this boy kicked away from the fish auctions by men like Thaddeus Vance, treated like an annoying stray dog. Yet Cora was treating him like a scholar. She was building a bridge into a dark, silent world, using nothing but the debris of the Atlantic shore and her own bottomless patience. "He's a smart lad, Silas," Cora said, not turning her head, though she had clearly heard his heavy boots in the sand. Leo immediately shrank back behind her navy blue skirt as his small hands gripping the heavy cotton fabric. "He doesn't lack a mind. He only lacks someone with the decency to listen to the silence." Silas walked closer, his large shadow falling over the drawings in the sand. He looked at Leo, then down at Cora. "The town won't like you bringing him around the yard," he said, his voice neutral, though the protective instinct in his bones was beginning to stir. Beatrice Thorne says the boy is a thief. Leo steals bread because his stomach is empty, not because his heart is crooked, Cora replied, her voice firm as she stood up, brushing the dry sand from her apron. She looked at the boy and made a quick, elegant gesture with her hands, a sweeping motion toward the house. Leo looked at Silas with a lingering flash of wariness, then turned and ran toward the kitchen door like a deer. I've taught him the signs for wood and iron today. He's going to help me stack the oak scraps by the stove. You're making a lot of work for yourself, Cora, Silas murmured, looking out toward the gray water. A shipyard that only builds boats is just a business, Silas, she said softly, walking beside him as they turned back toward the main house. My father used to say that a home is measured by how much shelter it can give when the weather turns. Right now, that boy needs a harbor. She didn't just carry for the boy, she was reorganizing the entire financial life of the Sterling legacy. That evening, as the lamps were lit, Cora laid a neatly written manifest before Silas. By bypassing the Port Authority's corrupt middlemen, she had established a direct trade agreement with the poorer, isolated gill netters down at the southern hook of the island. They would supply the yard with hand-braided hemp rope and whale oil for half the price Thaddeus Vance charged in exchange for Cora teaching their daughters to read on Saturday afternoons. Silas looked at the numbers, then up at his wife. He rose from his chair, walked to the dark corner of the parlor, and returned, holding a heavy linen-wrapped object. He set it on the table before her. When Cora unwrapped the fabric, she gasped softly. It was a beautiful, hand-carved oak bookshelf, its edges polished to a mirror shine, the top trim detailed with the delicate swirling pattern of ocean waves. Tucked inside were 3 thick leather-bound volumes of maritime medicine and advanced navigation, the very books she had been forced to leave behind at the village schoolhouse. I went back to the schoolhouse after dark last night, Silas said, his rough voice dropping into a low, slightly awkward register. He rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly self-conscious. Thaddeus had locked him in the woodshed. I told him if he didn't hand him over, I'd throw him off his own dock. I carved the shelf myself when my father was sick. I thought you might want your books back. Cora stared at the oak shelf, her fingers brushing the carved waves. For a long, breathless moment, she didn't speak, and Silas worried he had crossed some invisible boundary. But when she raised her face, her eyes were bright with a thin sheen of unshed tears. The smile she gave him wasn't her defensive armor, nor was it the practical grin of a business partner. It was a soft, trembling expression of pure, deeply felt gratitude, a smile that made the cold, drafty house feel suddenly undeniably warm. Thank you, Silas, she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. No one has ever fought for me before. Silas looked away, his jaw tightening as a strange, fierce heat bloomed in his chest. He realized then that he wasn't just keeping a contract anymore. He was protecting something rare, something beautiful that the small minds of Ocracoke had tried to bury in the mud. But as the winter wind began to rattle the kitchen windows, carrying the distant, ominous echo of a horse galloping down the island road, Silas knew that Thaddeus Vance would not let this quiet defiance go unpunished. The storm inside the village was brewing, and it would find them soon. The frost that hardened the salt marshes by late November brought a sharp, biting clarity to the air. But inside the Regional Educational Board's office in the village center, the atmosphere was thick with malice. Thaddeus Vance sat at the long mahogany table, his fingers tapping a rhythmic, arrogant beat against a stack of official documents. Beside him, Beatrice Thorne sat with her chin high, her silk shawl pulled tight against the draft, looking like an ancient self-appointed judge. They had gathered 5 members of the county school board under the pretense of an emergency hearing. The petition they had submitted was ruthless. It demanded the permanent revocation of Cora's teaching license, citing her unorthodox methods and labeling her as a moral liability who used her marriage to exploit state contracts. Silas stood at the back of the crowded room, his broad shoulders leaning against the cedar-paneled wall. His jaw set so tightly the muscles in his cheek twitched. His hands, buried deep in his heavy wool coat pockets, were clenched into white-knuckled fists. He had spent the morning trying to convince Cora to let him handle this. He wanted to bring Caleb Finch and 3 of his largest shipwrights to drag Thaddeus Vance into the street and settle the matter with iron and muscle. But Cora had looked at him with that calm, unshakable focus and refused. She had told him that hiding behind a husband's anger would only prove their point, that she was a helpless parasite. She would face the board on her own merit, or she would not face them at all. Cora sat alone at the small wooden desk in the center of the room, facing her accusers. She wore the same navy blue dress from her wedding day, its fabric pressed and neat, her dark hair pinned back without a single stray strand. When Thaddeus Vance stood up to read the charges, his voice oozing with a patronizing pity, she did not look down. He spoke of the mute boy, Leo calling him a dangerous vagrant who was being allowed to roam the shipyard under her supervision. He spoke of the secret trade agreements she had made with the poor gill-netters at the Southern Hook, spinning her charity into a corrupt scheme to undercut the Port Authority's established tariffs. The state of North Carolina does not fund schools so that outcasts can teach vagrants how to sign in the dark. Thaddeus sneered, tossing the paper onto the table with a theatrical sigh. Mrs. Sterling has abandoned the approved curriculum in favor of a personal crusade that serves only to disrupt the economic order of this harbor. For the safety of our children and the dignity of our town, her license must be stripped. Beatrice Thorne nodded in grim agreement, her eyes fixed on Cora like a hawk watching a field mouse. The woman has always been a disruption, first with Julian Cross and now with the Sterling family. She brings the storm with her wherever she goes. The room fell into a suffocating silence as the head of the educational board turned to Cora, asking if she had anything to say in her defense. Silas moved to step forward, the sheer fury in his chest, threatening to break through his promise to her. But Cora raised her left hand slightly, a subtle signal that kept him pinned to the wall. She stood up slowly, her movements graceful and unhurried. She didn't look at Thaddeus or Beatrice. She looked directly at the 3 independent board members who had traveled from the mainland. "I have no grand speeches to make," Cora said, her melodic voice carrying perfectly through the tense room. "A teacher's work is not measured by the opinions of those who sit in parlors. It is measured by the literacy of the people who do the work. If you wish to judge my fitness, you should look at the ledger of this island, not the gossip of its merchants." She reached into her small canvas bag and pulled out a stack of 7 grease-stained, oil-smudged papers. Silas felt a sudden fierce pride swell in his chest as he recognized them. The night before, respecting her boundary but refusing to remain idle, Silas had ridden his horse through a freezing rain to the furthest, most impoverished fishing shanties along the southern shoals. He had gone to the men who had never been allowed inside the village church, the men Thaddeus Vance cheated every season because they couldn't read the receipts. He had asked them to write down what Cora had done for their families. Cora placed the letters on the mahogany table before the board. "These are the testimonies of 7 fishermen," she said softly, her eyes flashing with a sudden brilliant intensity. "Men who can now check the weight of their own catch because I taught them their numbers after the schoolhouse doors were locked. These are the letters of mothers whose children no longer starve because I helped them write to the mainland for the state medical aid they were legally owed but couldn't apply for. And as for Leo," she paused, her voice softening just a fraction though her spine remained straight as a mast. "He is not a vagrant. He is a child who was left to rot in the silence, and he has learned more geography from the shells on the sand in 3 weeks than Thaddeus Vance has learned in his entire life." One of the mainland board members picked up the top letter, his thumb smoothing over a dark smudge of fish oil. He read the crude, painful handwriting of an old gill-netter named Martha, who wrote that Cora Vance was the only soul on Ocracoke who didn't look at her children like they were trash. The board members leaned in together, whispering in low, serious tones as they reviewed the letters. Thaddeus Vance's face turned a dangerous mottled red, his eyes darting toward Silas with a venomous realization that the shipyard owner had orchestrated this defense from the shadows. After 10 agonizing minutes, the head of the board looked up, his expression clear and resolute. He looked at Thaddeus, then back at Cora. "The purpose of education in this state is to lift our citizens out of ignorance, Mrs. Sterling. It appears you have done more for the literacy of this island's working class in your spare time than this parish has accomplished in a decade. The petition is denied. Your license stands, and your schoolhouse will remain open." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Beatrice Thorne rose from her seat so quickly her chair scraped violently against the floor, her face pale with disbelief, while Thaddeus Vance glared at Silas with the raw, murderous hatred of a man whose pocketbook had just been threatened. Cora did not gloat. She simply bowed her head to the board, gathered her canvas bag, and walked down the center aisle of the room. When she reached the door, Silas walked beside her, his massive frame shielding her from the hostile stares of the departing crowd. They didn't speak until they were back in the wooden wagon, the horse moving at a brisk trot away from the village and toward the safety of the marsh. The cold wind whipped at Cora's hair, but as she looked down at her hands, Silas saw that she was trembling. The adrenaline of the battle was fading, leaving behind the raw exhaustion of a woman who had spent 11 years fighting the world alone. Silas reached over his large, warm hand covering hers on the wooden bench. "You did well, Cora," he said, his baritone voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "You broke them today." Cora closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his hand steady her. "We broke them, Silas," she whispered, a soft, tired smile touching her lips as she leaned her shoulder lightly against his heavy wool coat. "But Thaddeus won't stop here. He lost his grip on the school, which means he will try to destroy the shipyard next. The winter is coming, and he will use the weather to do what his laws couldn't." Silas tightened his grip on her hand, his eyes fixed on the horizon where a massive bank of black bruising clouds was beginning to rise out of the Atlantic. The air was turning dangerously cold, the scent of heavy ozone marking the approach of a monster storm. He knew she was right. The battle in the courtroom was over. But the true test of their survival, both against the malice of the town and the fury of the ocean, was about to crash against their shores. The Atlantic Ocean did not merely rise that December night. It broke over the Outer Banks like a black iron wall driven by a violent nor'easter hurricane that screamed through the salt marshes. By 10 o'clock, the wind had reached a deafening roar, shaking the massive cypress timbers of the Sterling house and forcing freezing spray through every micro fissure in the window frames. Down at the docks, the water had already swallowed the lower piers, transforming the quiet shipyard into a treacherous, churning battlefield of floating logs, snapping hemp lines, and blinding horizontal sheets of rain. Silas stood on the edge of the north slip, his oilskin coat plastered to his heavy frame, his face raw from the stinging salt ice. The tide was coming in faster than any man in Ocracoke had predicted, threatening to rip the half-finished hulls right off their wooden blocks and crush them against the rocky shoreline. Alongside Caleb Finch and 4 younger shipwrights, Silas worked by the frantic swinging glare of kerosene lanterns, fighting to lash down a massive stack of seasoned white oak timbers. Every breath was a struggle against the gale. Every step on the slick submerged dock was a gamble with death. Suddenly, a terrifying crack split through the howling wind, followed by a sharp, agonizing scream from the north pier. Silas dropped his rope and swung his lantern toward the noise. Through the white sheets of spray, he saw that the rising water had violently dislodged a heavy spare mast. The massive pine timber had rolled off its rack, pinning a 19-year-old apprentice sailor named Thomas beneath its crushing weight. The boy was trapped in the freezing surf, the rising tide already lapping cruelly at his chest. "Silas, the water's too high. The current will drag us under if we go out there," Caleb yelled, his voice barely audible over the roaring thunder of the surf. "He won't survive 10 minutes in that water," Silas roared back, his jaw tightening into a hard, stubborn line. Without a second thought, he grabbed an iron crowbar and plunged into the waist-deep freezing water, his boots fighting the treacherous undertow as he waded into the dark surf toward the trapped boy. While the men fought the sea at the docks, the Sterling house had been transformed into an island of calm authority. Cora had cleared the large kitchen table, stoking the hearth fire until the massive stone chimney radiated a deep, fierce heat. She had torn old linen sheets into neat bandages, set pots of rainwater to boil, and laid out her father's old maritime medical journals and surgical kit under the bright glow of 2 large lamps. She didn't pace, she didn't pray with the frantic helplessness the village women often showed during a gale. Her movements were precise, deliberate, and perfectly steady. The back door suddenly burst open with a violent slam, admitting a blast of freezing wind, a torrent of water, and Leo, the 9-year-old mute boy, was drenched to the bone, his face pale with terror, his thin chest heaving. He didn't waste time trying to make a sound. Instead, he grabbed Cora's apron, his small hands shaking violently as he pointed frantically toward the north pier, his fingers rapidly mimicking the cracking of a mast and the pinning of a leg in the sign language she had taught him on the sand. Cora looked at the boy's eyes, immediately understanding the high stakes. She did not panic. She grabbed a thick wool blanket, threw it over Leo's shivering shoulders, and pushed him gently toward the hearth. "You did well, Leo. You braved the eye of the storm to tell me," she said, her calm, melodic voice cutting through the terrifying rattle of the window panes like an anchor catching ground. "Now stay by the fire and keep that water boiling. They are coming." 20 minutes later, the door opened again, and Silas staggered into the kitchen, his broad shoulders supporting the weight of the semi-conscious apprentice, while Caleb followed behind, carrying the boy's mangled legs. The kitchen smelled instantly of wet wool, sea mud, and cold adrenaline. They laid Thomas on the long pine table, his face white, his lips blue from hypothermia, his left leg twisted at a sickening, unnatural angle where the pine mast had crushed the bone. Silas looked up at Cora, his eyes wide with a rare, desperate anxiety. He was a man who knew how to shape iron and fight the sea, but in the face of human shattering, he felt completely useless. The mast crushed his shin, Cora. The town doctor refused to ride out to the marsh in this weather. He told Caleb we'd have to wait until morning. The boy will bleed to death internally before morning, Cora said, her voice completely devoid of hesitation as she stepped up to the table. She looked down at Thomas, then directly into Silas's eyes. The defensive armor she had worn for 11 years was entirely gone, replaced by the fierce, magnificent competence of a true daughter of the sea. I need your hands, Silas. They are strong and they need to hold him perfectly still while I reset this bone. Caleb, pour a cup of that willow bark tea down his throat if he can swallow. Leo, bring the splints from the corner. Under the flickering light of the hurricane lamps, Cora went to work. She used her sharp shears to cut away the wet canvas trousers, exposing the severe compound fracture. With absolute precision, she guided Silas's massive hands to anchor the boy's hips, using his strength to counter the violent tremors of Thomas's shock. Cora worked with a methodical, peaceful rhythm, her fingers identifying the fragments of bone through the torn flesh. When the moment came to pull the leg straight and snap the bone back into its proper alignment, Thomas let out a sharp groan and passed out completely from the pain. Silas braced for a cry or a moment of hesitation from his wife, but Cora's hands didn't shake. She set the bone, packed the wound with camphor and clean moss, and bound it tightly with the linen strips, her movements as smooth and practiced as a sailmaker repairing a torn canvas in a gale. By midnight, the worst of the nor'easter had passed, the wind shifting to a low, mournful sigh over the salt marshes. Thomas was resting comfortably under 3 heavy quilts by the hearth, his breathing deep and even, the color slowly returning to his cheeks. Caleb had fallen asleep in a chair by the fire, his old joints finally warm. Silas walked over to the dry sink where Cora was washing the blood and salt mud from her hands. He stood behind her, his large frame blocking the draft from the window. He looked at the clean bandages, the open medical books, and then at her profile in the dim lamplight. He had seen her defy the town with a smile, and he had seen her organize his failing ledgers. But tonight, he had seen her pull a boy back from the edge of the grave while the Atlantic tried to tear the roof off his house. You saved him, Cora. Silas murmured, his baritone voice thick with a profound, reverent emotion. He reached out his large, rough fingers, gently catching hers under the water, turning her around to face him. The doctor left him to die because he lived on my docks. But you didn't even blink. Cora looked up at Tid, her dark eyes reflecting the fading amber embers of the hearth. For the first time, she let her forehead rest lightly against his wet wool chest, her breathing finally slowing. I told you, Silas. This ocean takes whatever it wants if you let it. I spent 11 years watching people drown in their own grief. I wasn't going to let it take that boy tonight, not in our home. Silas tightened his arms around her, pulling her close against his chest. The shared survival of the night had permanently welded their souls together, stripping away the last remnants of the forced contract that had brought them to the altar. He knew the morning would bring a massive cleanup at the shipyard, and he knew Thaddeus Vance would be waiting in the village with new schemes now that the storm had failed to destroy the Sterling docks. But as Silas held his wife in the quiet, warm kitchen, listening to the peaceful breathing of the boy they had saved, he knew the wolves of Ocracoke were out of time. They had tried to destroy him by forcing him to marry an outcast, but they had accidentally given him the only partner strong enough to help him conquer the harbor. The pale, crisp sunlight of a Sunday morning in December did not bring warmth to Ocracoke Harbor. Instead, it illuminated the wreckage left behind by the nor'easter. The scent of drying salt mud, crushed oyster shells, and cheap tobacco hung heavy over the central fish market where the entire village had gathered for the weekly seafood auction. The storm had passed, but the tension in the harbor had only solidified. Silas walked down the gravel path toward the main pier, his boots leaving deep impressions in the damp earth, his large frame projecting an unyielding calmness. Beside him, Cora walked with her usual quiet grace, her navy blue dress brushed clean, her hands clasped loosely over the canvas bag containing the shipyard's newly corrected financial ledgers. The crowd parted reluctantly as they approached, a low, hostile murmur rippling through the rows of fishermen and merchants. The news of Cora's victory at the educational board had already spread through the island like a brush fire, and the townspeople did not swallow the defeat easily. To them, the fact that an outcast woman and a struggling shipyard owner had defied the authority of the parish's wealthiest citizens was an insult to the established order of the harbor. Beatrice Thorne stood at the center of the pier, surrounded by 3 of the harbor's primary fish brokers. Her silk shawl was pinned with a silver brooch that caught the sharp winter sun, her face frozen in an expression of permanent aristocratic disdain. Beside her stood Thaddeus Vance, his eyes bloodshot, his wool coat rumpled from a sleepless week spent trying to hide the remnants of his exposed iron fraud. When he saw Silas and Cora step onto the wooden planks of the pier, his mouth twisted into a dangerous feral sneer. He stepped forward, intentionally blocking the path to the main auction table, ensuring the entire harbor could hear his voice. "Look at them," Thaddeus announced, his voice carrying clearly over the slap of the tide against the pilings. "The great savior of the salt marshes and his jinx of a wife. You think because you brought a few letters from the trash down at the Southern Hook that you own this harbor, Cora? You think this board's license changes what you are?" Cora stopped, her posture straight as a mainmast, her expression perfectly calm. She did not shrink back, nor did she look down at the wooden planks. She simply watched him with a steady, unbothered focus that seemed to infuriate him further. Beatrice Thorne stepped forward, her cane clicking sharply against the timber. "The state might let you keep your schoolhouse, Cora Vance, but a piece of government paper won't wash the salt mud off your name. Everyone in this harbor knows why Silas Sterling married you. He didn't want you. He was cornered into you by the law to keep his father's slips from going under. You're nothing but a legal shield, a desperate old maid who used a dead man's memory and a living man's bankruptcy to buy herself a household." A sharp, cruel laugh bubbled up from the merchants behind Beatrice. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, filled with the ugly, judgmental satisfaction of a town that had spent 11 years trying to keep Cora in the dark. Silas felt the blood roar in his ears, a violent protective heat exploding in his chest. He felt Cora's fingers lightly touch the sleeve of his heavy coat, a silent request for him to hold his peace. But this time the anchor in his bones broke. The memory of her washing the blood from her hands by the flickering lamplight, after saving the apprentice, the image of her teaching Leo to write with shells on the cold sand, and the decade of silent cruelty she had endured, rushed through his mind like a rogue wave. Silas stepped in front of his wife, his massive frame completely eclipsing her from Thaddeus Vance's sight. He slammed his heavy leather ledger down onto the fish auction table with a deafening thud that silenced the entire pier. "That's enough, Thaddeus," Silas said, his baritone voice dropping into a low, thunderous rumble that cut through the ocean breeze like an iron blade. He didn't shout, but the raw, lethal authority in his tone made the fish brokers step back a pace. "You want to talk about legal shields and desperation? Then let's talk about the manifests you've been printing for the last 3 years. Thaddeus went pale, his eyes darting toward the leather book on the table. "You don't know what you're talking about, Sterling. That's private harbor business." "It's a public fraud," Silas roared, stepping closer until he was inches from Thaddeus's face. His jaw clenched so hard the muscles in his neck strained against his collar. "My wife didn't just teach the Fisher kids how to read. She taught me how to read your arithmetic. For 3 winters, you and your agents have been shorting every shipyard on this spit by 2 tons of blacksmith iron a season. You padded the bills because you thought my father was too sick to check the numbers, and you thought I was too stupid to look past the timber. My wife found the rot, Thaddeus. She laid out every stolen penny on the ledger, and the regional maritime commissioner on the mainland has already received the copy." The crowd fell into a suffocating, breathless silence. The fishermen in the back row, men who had suffered under Thaddeus's high tariffs for a decade, leaned forward, their weathered faces shifting from curiosity to a sudden burning anger. Silas turned his head, his eyes sweeping over the 63 people packed onto the pier, refusing to let a single pair of eyes look away. "And as for why I married her," he said, his voice dropping into a solemn, ringing register that vibrated through the cold, salt air. "Beatrice is right about one thing. I went to that church a reluctant man. I went there because I was a fool who listened to the gossip of small-minded people who live in parlors. But marrying Cora Vance is the greatest honor of my miserable life." He turned back to Cora, his expression softening into something raw, fiercely proud, and entirely transparent. This town turned its back on the only soul strong enough to keep its secrets and carry for its children. You called her a curse because she kept a promise to a better man than any of you will ever be. You tried to starve her, you tried to break her, but she stayed. She built a harbor in my kitchen. She pulled an apprentice out of the freezing surf when your own doctor stayed in bed, and she gave a voice to a boy you treated like trash. Silas looked back at Thaddeus, his eyes dark with an absolute unyielding finality. The state contract belongs to my father's sweat, but my home belongs to her. I will spend the rest of my days ensuring she never has to hold her spine straight against your malice alone. If anyone in this harbor has an issue with my wife's dignity, you come to my docks and you settle it with me. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the crying of the gulls and the rushing of the tide. Thaddeus Vance stared at the floorboards, his power completely broken, his reputation shattered by the weight of the financial truth on the table. Beatrice Thorne pulled her shawl around her face, her eyes cold but defeated, recognizing that the town's grip on Cora had slipped forever. Then from the back of the pier, a rough, calloused hand began to clap. It was Caleb Finch, his old face split by a massive, triumphant grin. A moment later, an old gill netter joined in. Within seconds, the applause spread through the crowd of fishermen, rising into a loud, rhythmic roar that echoed off the weathered cedar walls of the fish houses, shattering 11 years of Cora's isolation in a single, magnificent afternoon. Silas reached down his large, warm hand, finding Cora's fingers. When he looked at her, he saw that she wasn't looking at the crowd or her defeated accusers. She was looking at him, her dark eyes shining with a brilliant, untamed warmth. The smile she gave him wasn't her armor or her defense. It was a soft, trembling expression of pure, unadulterated belonging. She didn't have to fight the wind alone anymore. As Silas led her away from the pier and toward the wagon, the winter sun seemed to finally break through the gray clouds, lighting up the path before them, with the golden promise of a shore that had finally been won. By the time the amber light of October rolled across the outer banks, the salt marshes had turned a deep golden bronze, as if the earth itself were settling into a hard-won peace after a season of violent gales. The air was crisp, carrying the clean, sharp scent of cedar wood smoke and dry pine needles down to the waters of Pamlico Sound. At the Sterling shipyard, the heavy rhythmic thumping of caulking mallets and the screaming of iron saws filled the morning, but it was no longer the sound of a desperate struggle against bankruptcy. It was the music of a thriving legacy. The state rescue and maintenance contract had been officially renewed for another 5 years, secured not just by the quality of the timber Silas shaped, but by the flawless, transparent financial bookkeeping that now defined the harbor's trade. The village of Ocracoke had begun to tell the story of the Sterlings, the way small, isolated coastal towns always tell the stories they are ultimately proud of with a great deal of revision. Some romantic embellishment and the particular convenient conviction of people who preferred to remember themselves at their best rather than their cruelest. In the local dry goods stores and taverns, the merchants now spoke of Cora Vance's wedding day as a moment of community providence rather than a public execution. They conveniently forgot the 63 pairs of judgmental eyes that had stared at her navy blue dress, choosing instead to boast about how their island had produced a woman with the intellect to break Thaddeus Vance's fraud and the steel to save an apprentice's leg in the dead of a Category hurricane. But Cora remembered and Silas knew, and between the two of them, the memory of the wind was enough to keep them anchored. The structural changes to the Sterling household were subtle, but profound, visible in the way the cold, austere house on the peninsula had finally surrendered to the warmth of human life. The village schoolhouse had been officially restored to Cora's care, backed by the regional board's unshakable authority, but her mornings still began in the kitchen on the marsh. Leo, the 9-year-old boy who had spent his winters scavenging for fish scraps in the dark, now sat at the long pine table. Every breakfast, his face clean, his small frame filling out under a heavy wool sweater Silas had bought him from the mainland. The boy had been formally adopted by the law and the household thriving as Silas's shadow in the molding lofts. Leo didn't lack a voice anymore. His fingers moved with a lightning-fast, beautiful fluency through the air, translating the world of iron oak and wind for the man who had given him a harbor. On a quiet Saturday evening when the tide was low and the ocean breeze had dropped to a soft, cool whisper, Silas led Cora down to the main pier of the shipyard. The water was as smooth as dark glass, reflecting the first brilliant stars of the autumn sky, and the steady revolving white beam of the Cape Hatteras lighthouse in the distance. Tied to the deep-water pilings was the pride of the yard, a magnificent newly finished 30-foot flagship vessel, its cypress hull polished until it gleamed like dark honey, its rigging tight and perfect. As they reached the edge of the wooden planks, Cora caught her breath, her hand flying to her lips. In the soft twilight, she could see the bow of the ship. Silas had spent the previous 3 nights working by lantern light after the shipwrights had gone home hand-carving and painting the vessel's name in flawless, shimmering gold letters, the Cora. "She's the finest hull my father's patterns ever drew, Cora," Silas said, his low, gravelly baritone vibrating with an emotion he no longer tried to hide behind his stoic guard. He stepped closer to her, his massive frame shielding her from the gathering chill of the evening. "She's built to run straight into the teeth of an Atlantic gale and come back without a scratch. I thought it was only right she carried the name of the woman who taught this yard how to weather the storm." Cora turned to face him, her dark eyes reflecting the golden letters on the hull and the soft light of the stars. For 11 years, her presence on this island had been treated as an insult to the dead, a jinx that seafaring men avoided out of fear and superstition. To see her name carved into the finest wood on the coast, celebrated by the very man who had been cornered into taking her hand, was a restoration so complete it made the breath catch in her throat. Silas reached into his heavy wool coat pocket and pulled out a small linen square. When he unfolded it, a simple, elegant silver ring embedded with a small, flawless coastal pearl caught the moonlight. It was a stark contrast to the cheap, tarnished brass band they had used at the altar when Arthur Pendleton was counting the minutes on his pocket watch. He took her left hand, his large, rough fingers surprisingly gentle as he slid the silver ring onto her finger, covering the old brass band forever. "We signed a ledger in that church because the law demanded a sacrifice, Cora," Silas whispered, his voice dropping into a deep, solemn register that seemed to carry the weight of every silent night they had shared by the hearth. "But I'm asking you now as a man who knows he'd be lost in the dark without you. Will you stay with me, not for the contract and not for the house, but because you are the shoreline I've been looking for my whole life?" Cora looked down at the pearl on her finger, then up into the face of the husband who had ridden through a freezing storm to collect testimonies for her honor, the man who had stood between her and the venom of the entire harbor. The heavy protective armor she had worn since the night Julian Cross vanished into the Atlantic finally dissolved, leaving behind only the pure, unburdened truth of a woman who had outlasted her own tragedy. She smiled. It was not the fierce, defiant grin she had thrown at the 63 gossips in the pews, nor was it the pragmatic, guarded expression she used to conquer Thaddeus Vance's ledgers. It was a soft, radiant, and deeply vulnerable smile of absolute, unconditional happiness, a smile that made the vast, dark expanse of the Atlantic coast feel suddenly completely safe. Silas drew her into his arms, pulling her tight against his chest as the distant murmur of the surf rolled over the salt marshes. The town of Ocracoke would continue to tell their story for generations, changing the details to suit their own conscience, leaving out their own cruelty because it reflected least well on them. They would tell their children that Abigail Carter had come to a lonely ranch in Willow Creek, or that Cora Vance had married a shipwright in the marshes of the Outer Banks, changing the names and the scenery to fit whatever wilderness they were trying to conquer. But the ocean would remember the truth. It would remember that a storm could shatter the strongest timber, but it could never break a woman who knew how to hold her head up against the wind. And it took a truly strong man to look past the shield of a woman's smile to find the soul worth saving.